The French Broad had been rising since Tuesday. Kieran Vassos had been watching rivers his whole life, 34 years of reading water the way other people read faces. And he knew what the French Broad looked like when it was angry versus when it was just awake. This was something else. 4 days of rain across the Pisgah Range, plus a warm front pushing the last of the high-elevation snow off the slopes, and the gorge below Barnard was carrying more volume than he'd seen in April in a decade. The color had gone from its usual spring green-brown to a flat, opaque gray. The sound had changed. The river wasn't talking anymore. It was making a pronouncement. He'd been on the water since 5:30 in the morning, running patrol sweeps with his trainee crew, pulling the last of the marker buoys before they became hazards. 2 of his guides had already called in that sections of the Narrows were running at levels they wouldn't authorize for any commercial trip. He'd agreed. He'd pulled the permits for the day. 23 years of teaching people how not to die on moving water, and he still knew when the river was the smartest person in the room. He was loading equipment at the Stackhouse takeout when the call came through. Kieran, it was Buncombe County Dispatch. Lorraine, who had been working that radio since before Kieran got his first Swiftwater certification. Her voice had the specific flatness of someone conveying bad news in the most efficient possible format. We've got 3 kayakers pinned at the Upper Narrows. Class 4 puttin', above the gorge bend. A tulip poplar came down across the channel. Looks like the root system let go in the rain. Trees bridging the gorge wall to wall, and the hydraulics behind it are trapping them. Kieran was already moving. How long have they been in the water? First call came in 11 minutes ago. They're not in the water. They're on top of their boats, on top of the log, which is the only reason we're not calling this a recovery. He knew that bent. He knew exactly what the hydraulics looked like behind a full-span tree blockage at high water, the way the current piled into the downstream face, creating a recirculating hole that would take a person apart if they went in. He knew what the spray looked like in the gorge. He knew what sound it made. "I need a faller," he said. "Already called," Lorraine said. "Minh Tran, Buncombe County Emergency Response? He's 12 minutes out." Kieran stopped walking for exactly 1 second. He knew that name. He'd seen it on incident reports for 2 years. The arborist who'd cleared the root ball blocking the Ivy River access road after Hurricane Fred. The one who'd taken down a widowmaker pine over a live power line in Weaverville at 2 in the morning during an ice storm. He showed up first. He cut clean. His notes in the county incident logs were the shortest of anyone's 3 sentences. Sometimes 4. Tree removed. Access restored. No secondary hazards. The kind of notes written by someone who thought precision and brevity were the same thing. He had a mental image. It was probably wrong. "Tell him I'm already at Stackhouse," Kieran said, "and tell him to bring his climbing rig. The only way onto that log is from above." The truck that pulled into the Stackhouse lot 12 minutes later was a white county forestry vehicle, and the man who got out of it was not what Kieran had expected, which meant his mental image had in fact been wrong. Minh Tran was lean in the way of someone whose job burned everything unnecessary. Medium height, mid-30s, Vietnamese American, with the kind of composed face that didn't announce anything before it was decided. He was moving the way Kieran moved on water, not fast, but with zero wasted motion, pulling his climbing harness and chainsaw kit from the truck bed in a sequence that was obviously automatic. Safety glasses on his helmet, arborist throw line already coiled over one shoulder. The jacket he was wearing had the county forestry logo and sawdust in the seams, and a small dark stain on the left cuff that had been there long enough to stop being a stain and start being part of the jacket. He looked at the river before he looked at Kieran. That was the first thing. He stood at the bank and looked at the water for 4 or 5 seconds. Reading it, Kieran could see him reading it, the way his eyes tracked the current lines and the eddy fences, and then he looked at Kieran. "Vassos," he said, "Tran." Kieran held out a hand. Minh shook it once. "Clean. Let go. You know the gorge. I took down an ash over the lower access trail in March. I know the upper bend from the trail system. I haven't seen it from the water. I'll walk you through it. The log is full span. I'm guessing 50-60 feet of tulip poplar, probably 30 inches diameter at chest height. The kayakers are on the upstream face, sitting on their boats. Current is pinning them. If the log shifts or they go over the downstream side, they're in the hole," Minh said. Not a question. Minh looked at the river again. "I need to see the root ball. If the root plate already sheared clean, I have more options. If there's still a hinge, the bank access is a 1/4 mile up the trail. I have a throw rope team staging at the canyon rim. We can lower you to the log once you've assessed." For the first time something moved in Min's expression. Not quite surprise, but something that recalibrated. "You already rigged a lowering system." "I've been on this water since 5:30, Kieran said. "I knew when the tree went that I'd need a faller. I just didn't know it was going to be you." Minh looked at him for a moment. One of those looks that didn't explain itself. "Let's go," he said. The trail to the Upper Narrows was 40 minutes. At normal pace and 20 minutes at the pace, Kieran and Minh moved, not running, but covering ground the way people do when they've both spent years moving efficiently in terrain that didn't give second chances. Kieran noticed this about him the same way he'd noticed the river reading at the truck. Minh moved like someone who had thought about every step before he took it. Not because he was cautious, but because efficiency and caution had, at some point in his life, become the same reflex. The gorge came into view through the tree line, and Kieran heard Minh go quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Below them, the French Broad was extraordinary and terrible. The water was the color of unpolished pewter, running, fast and full, and across the channel, bridging both walls of the gorge in one long diagonal, a tulip poplar had fallen with the total commitment of something that had been standing for 80 years and had decided, finally, to stop. Its root ball had sheared from the east bank when the saturated hillside gave way. The crown was resting against the west wall rock face, branches submerged on the downstream side. The main trunk crossing the water maybe 8 feet above the current at mid. On the upstream face of that trunk, 3 kayakers were sitting on top of their boats. They'd managed to climb up onto the log when the hydraulic pushed them into it. One of them was waving. "They look okay," Kieran said. "For now." Minh was already analyzing the tree. Kieran could see it, the way his eyes moved from the root plate to the crown to the contact points with the canyon walls. The root ball is still partially attached. The hinge is on the east bank. See where the wood is folded? It hasn't fully separated, which means the log has movement in it. How much movement? Depends on current force and how fast the hinge degrades. Could be hours, could be less. Kieran looked at the kayakers. One of them was now lying flat on the log, which was smarter than sitting lower center of gravity. I can get a line to them from the rim, but pulling them off the upstream face means crossing the log or going under it, and neither of those is survivable if the tree shifts while someone's in the water. So the tree moves first. Minh crouched at the rim, still looking. I need to work from the log itself. If I can establish an anchor at the base of the crown, he was pointing at the section where the tree rested against the west wall, and cut a relief section at mid-span, the downstream pressure drops enough that the hydraulic behind it weakens, and the kayakers, once the hydraulic softens, they can push off the upstream face and run the current to the left eddy. He looked at Kieran. If the left eddy is workable, it's workable. It's wide and it's calm. I've been putting beginners in that eddy since 2008. Kieran paused. But the section between the log and the eddy is still class 4. They'll need to make 2 moves in sequence. Can they make those moves? Kieran looked at the kayakers again. The one who was lying flat had now turned to look up at the rim at them. He raised one hand. "I see ya. I'm okay. What's the plan?" "The one in the middle can," Kieran said. "He's been reading the water since we got here. The other 2 will need instruction." Minh stood. He looked at Kieran in that unreadable way again. "Then you handle the water half. I'll handle the tree." "That works," Kieran said. Something settled in the conversation. Not agreement exactly, something older than agreement. The kind of mutual recognition that doesn't need to be named. Getting Minh onto the log took 31 minutes. Kieran's rope team, 3 of his senior swiftwater instructors, people he'd worked with for years, rigged a lowering system from a white oak at the canyon rim with the efficiency of muscle memory. Minh checked every component of the rig himself before he stepped into the harness. Not because he distrusted them, but because he was the kind of person who checked things himself. Kieran watched him work through the system. Mainline, backup, redirect, anchor, redundancy, and didn't say anything. He would have done the same thing. Minh went over the edge. He descended the canyon wall in controlled stages, reading the rock face as he went, and landed on the log with the careful placement of someone who understood that everything below him was moving. From the rim, Kieran watched him establish his position, feet wide, one hand on the log, the other reaching for his throw line, and then he turned to his radio. "Kieran to mid-channel," he said. "How are you doing?" The middle kayaker's radio crackled. His name was Paul, and he had the voice of someone who'd been on rivers long enough to know that panic was a luxury. "Still here. Your guy made it down. He's going to run a line to the crown contact point. Once he has an anchor, he'll start the cut. When he does, you're going to feel the log shift. It'll go toward the west wall. Don't move until I tell you." "Copy." On the log, Minh had gotten his throw line to the crown and was rigging an anchor around a thick branch, where the tree rested against the west wall. He was moving slowly, deliberately, in a way that Kieran recognized as the speed of someone who had learned that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. There was a moment, watching him, when Kieran stopped calculating and just watched. He'd worked rescues with dozens of people over 2 decades. He knew the difference between someone doing a job and someone who had grown into a job until the line between the person and the work had become difficult to locate. Minh Tran was the second kind. The way he moved on that log, reading its flex, testing its movement before committing weight, understanding its structure from the outside in, it wasn't just technique. It was attention. The particular kind of attention that people develop for the things they've decided matter. Kieran had felt that exact thing about rivers his whole life. He'd never watched someone else feel it about something else, and felt recognized by it. He pulled his focus back to the kayakers. "Paul," he said into the radio, "when Minh starts cutting, I need you to start coaching the other 2. Left eddy entry. They need to peel out from the upstream face and make a right to left diagonal across the main flow. I'll be talking them through it from here, but you're closer." "I've got them," Paul said. "Tim's solid. Jay is going to need to hear it more than once." Tell Jay to focus on the eddy line, not the current. Pick a point on the far bank and paddle to it. Don't look at the water moving under him. Got it? On the log. Minh had started his chainsaw. The sound of it in the gorge was something the mechanical racket against. The stone walls and the river noise underneath it and the particular smell of fresh-cut tulip poplar rising up through the spray. Kieran watched the cut develop through his binoculars. Minh was working a relief section at mid-span, the way he'd described angling the cut to reduce the structural tension that the current was creating on the downstream face. He was working with the harness system Kieran's team had rigged, the rope taking weight off the log at exactly the right point. Then Minh stopped. Kieran keyed his radio. Minh status, there's a secondary crack I didn't see from the rim. Min's voice was level, but Kieran heard the edge of recalculation in it. 4 feet upstream of my cut, if I finish this section the way I planned, the log will drop on the east side before the hydraulic clears. Kieran looked at the kayakers. The east side was where Tim and Jay were positioned. How much time do you need to adjust? 6 minutes to reposition my anchor. Then another cut from above the crack. I split the section in 2 rather than 1. It takes longer, but the east side stays stable. The hinge, Kieran started. I know. 6 minutes is a risk. A pause? Shorter than most pauses. But dropping that east section on Tim and Jay is a certainty. Your call. Kieran looked at the water. He looked at the root ball. He looked at the hinge line on the east bank, calculated what he could see of its integrity against what he knew about saturated soil and tulip poplar root structure and April runoff in the southern Appalachians. Take the 6 minutes, he said. I'll watch the hinge. If it moves before you're done, I'll tell you. Another short pause. Okay. For 6 minutes, Kieran watched the hinge, and Minh repositioned his anchor. He talked to Paul, he talked to Tim, he talked to Jay 3 times. Each time shorter, each time watching Jay's posture on the log change from clenched to something approaching manageable. He watched the hinge on the east bank. He watched the root plate where it's still attached to the hillside, reading the small movements of the soil, the way water was sheeting off the exposed root mass. And while he did all of this, he was aware peripherally, continuously, of Minh on the log, the way Minh checked his new anchor twice, the way he reset his feet before he started the second cut, the way he looked up at the rim once, not at the rope team, at Kieran specifically, and Kieran keyed his radio without thinking about it. You're good, he said. Hinge is holding. Minh nodded once. Started the saw. The log came apart in 2 sections. Clean. The downstream section dropped into the current, and was carried away. 60 pounds of chainsaw-cut tulip poplar gone in seconds, the river taking it like it was nothing. The upstream section, where the kayakers were, rotated toward the west wall, as Minh had predicted, slowly, controlled, the hydraulic behind it softening as the channel cleared. Now, Kieran said into his radio, Paul first, right to left, diagonal, go. Paul went. He peeled off the upstream face of the log and cut across the current with the efficient angle of someone who had read that water correctly on the first assessment, and he was in the left eddy in 8 seconds. Tim, same line. Look at Paul in the eddy. Pedal toward him, go. Tim went. Messier, but clean enough. 12 seconds. Jay, pick a rock on the far bank. Just that rock. Nothing else. Go. Jay hesitated for 2 full seconds. Kieran could see it from the rim. The pause of someone fighting every instinct, and then he went. He looked at the rock. He paddled toward it. The current caught his stern and tried to push him downstream, and he held the angle. Barely. And then he was in the eddy, and Paul had his bow, and it was done. Kieran exhaled. He turned to his rope team. Pull Minh up. And then he was just standing at the rim of the gorge while his team worked the rope system, watching the French Broad run full and gray and fast below him, listening to it the way he'd been listening to rivers his whole life. The sound it made now, the hydraulic gone, the channel clear, just the river running its own business, was the sound of a problem solved. He was still listening to it when he heard Min's boots hit the rim behind him. He was coiling his throwline. That was the thing Kieran would remember later. That after everything, after the chainsaw and the canyon wall and the 6 minutes and the hinge and the 3 kayakers safely in the eddy being walked out by Kieran's ground team, after all of it, the first thing Minh did when he got back to solid ground was sit down on a rock near the rim and start coiling his throwline, methodically, loop by loop, like there was exactly one right way to do it, and he was going to do it that way even now. Kieran stood a few feet away and watched him without meaning to. He was aware that he was doing it. He was aware that Minh would, at some point, look up. He stayed anyway. It was the light that made it harder to look away. Late morning, April light in the Appalachians. After 4 days of rain, the way it came through the new leaf canopy in pieces, grand and specific, landing on things it chose. It was on Min's hands where they worked the line. It was on the side of his face where the shadow of his helmet brim ended. He had sawdust on his left shoulder and a small cut on his right hand, the base of his index finger. The kind of cut you get from something that grabbed unexpectedly. He hadn't mentioned it. He probably wouldn't. Kieran looked at the French Broad below them. You knew the secondary crack was there before you called it in, he said. Not an accusation. Just something he'd been thinking about. Min's hands didn't stop moving. I had a read on it. I wasn't certain, but you were leaning toward it. Yes. You should have told me. I was still confirming. A pause. You would have called a different approach if I'd flagged it as possible. The approach I had was still viable until it wasn't. Kieran thought about that. He didn't agree with it. Exactly, he believed in more information. Always. Because Rivers didn't wait for certainty, but he understood the logic. The kind of logic that comes from working alone for a long time. Being the only one who reads what you read. Making judgment calls that nobody else has the background to second guess. You work alone a lot, Kieran said. A short pause. Most of the time. Emergency tree response is usually one person and a truck. By the time backup is staged, the situation has already declared itself. Same with swift water. When something happens in the gorge, you're what you have. Kieran looked at him. It makes it hard to work with people. Min looked up then. The light was on his face, now full. He had dark eyes, not unreadable. Kieran had thought that at first, but it wasn't true. They were reading everything. They were just reading it quietly. You managed all right, Min said. You made it easy. The words came out simpler than Kieran had intended, which sometimes happened when he was being honest and not thinking fast enough to dress it up. You said what you needed and you did what you said. I've been running river rescues for 20 years, and I could count on one hand the people I've worked with who do both of those things. Min held his gaze for a moment, something in his expression carefully managed. Kieran could see it being managed, shifted slightly, the way a door shifts when a window opens somewhere else in the house. Your name's been on every major swiftwater incident in this county for as long as I've been doing this work, Min said. I've read your reports. I've read yours. I know you referenced my Ivy River clearance and your flood access protocol update last November. Kieran blinked. You read that? Buncombe County distributes those to every emergency responder in the watershed. It's in the same folder as the updated anchor point maps. The corner of Min's mouth moved. Barely. You cited my work correctly. For the record, I try to cite work correctly. Most people don't bother. They looked at each other. Below them, the French Broad was still running full. But the particular note of threat had gone out of it now that the channel was clear. It sounded like itself again, not angry, not making pronouncements. Just the river doing what rivers do, which was move. You grew up here, Min said. It wasn't a question. 12 years old, first time I ran the Narrows. My uncle had a rafting company. I thought I was going to do something else with my life until I got on the water and realized I already was. Kieran looked at the gorge below. You, Charlotte. My family had a tree service. A pause, just a beat. Just enough for Kieran to hear what wasn't being said inside it. I came up here for the work 8 years ago. Stayed. Kieran didn't push on the pause. He'd learned to listen to what Rivers didn't say. The gap between readings, where the water was doing something beneath the surface, you couldn't see but could feel if you paid attention. This was a gap like that. The work kept you, he asked. The mountains kept me. Min was looking at the canopy, the new April green overhead, the tulip poplars that were still standing, the understory coming into leaf, and the work. Another pause. It's the same thing. Mostly? Yeah, Kieran said. I know what that's like. He meant it specifically. The way a river gets into you at a certain point, not as scenery, not as workplace, but as something that organizes how you think, what you notice, what you care about. He'd never said that out loud to anyone who had looked back at him and understood what he meant. He'd tried once or twice, in different contexts, with different people, and it had always landed wrong, too much, or not quite right, or received politely the way you receive something you don't have a frame for. Min looked at him. I know you know, he said. Kieran was quiet for a moment. Around them, the gorge was settling into its post-emergency stillness. His rope team was packing gear 30 feet up the trail. Somewhere down the canyon, his ground team was walking 3 kayakers out to the parking area. Radios were going quiet. The work was finishing itself. There's a place on Merriman Avenue, Kieran said. Coffee from a roaster and good enough that I drove 40 minutes for it last winter during a road closure, which should tell you what you need to know. Min looked at him for a long moment, longer than strictly necessary for processing the information. The kind of moment where someone is deciding not what you said, but what you meant. I have to write the incident report first, he said. How long does that take you? 40 minutes if I'm thorough. 20 if I'm just honest. Be honest, Kieran said. Your reports are already better than anyone else's. Something happened in Min's expression that Kieran had not seen there before. Not quite a smile, but the preparation for one, the place a smile comes from before it decides to arrive. He looked down at the throw line in his hands. He finished the last loop, set it down on the rock next to him. I know where Merriman Avenue is, he said. Kieran nodded. I'll be the one who smells like river. I'll be the one with sawdust. Neither of them moved for a moment. Below them, the French Broad ran on, green and full and carrying everything the mountains had given it, the way it always did in April. The way it had been doing for longer than either of them could comprehend, and Kieran thought, not for the first time in his life, but for the first time in a long time, that a river doesn't wait for anyone to be ready. It just keeps moving, and sometimes the right thing to do is move with it.